Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm here today with Sara Protasi, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Puget Sound. And we're going to be talking about her chapter on envy and admiration. Sara, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm just going to jump right in and suggest that maybe the account that you give of boasting or some of the remarks you make about boasting seem to me like very modern and sort of Christian. So you say that all socially apt adults know that even if you sincerely believe that you're better than everyone else, you shouldn't say it out loud. And that kind of reminded me of this amazing moment after one of his championship bouts when Muhammad Ali was screaming, "I must be the greatest, I must be the greatest." He was even saying things to the interviewer like, "Look at me, I'm pretty. I'm pretty. I went 7 rounds with this guy and I'm still pretty." And it's kind of astonishing in a way, but he didn't seem to think that he shouldn't point out that he's better than other people. And I don't know, I think Ali was actually pretty socially adept. So what do
Yeah.
you make of cases like that?
Good. Yes, great question. Actually, as I was rereading the chapter in preparation for this interview, I paused exactly on those kind of things, and I do think that I overstated it a little bit, and partially because I was trying to really get the reader in, right? And I think when I was doing that, I think I was actually thinking too much through my own perspective and my own personality, which is, it's something that philosophers tend to do, no matter how much a lot of us try to be careful about empirical claims, right? It's really easy to fall into generalizing from one's own perspective. And so I do think there are of course idiosyncratic, there are individual differences. We're all different. And so there's going to be some people who tend to be more comfortable with boasting and some people who are really uncomfortable with it. And I do think maybe I fall more on the latter group. And there's going to be cultural differences, which are going to be historically sensitive. And so, I'm thinking about, Homeric poems, ancient Greeks, other cultures, right? Where they were like Muhammad Ali makes me think of those like warriors, right? In Homeric epics. Achilles would probably boast, I think. I mean, my memories of those poems are a little, not as current, but I imagine that there's going to be those differences. I also wonder about gender differences, actually. I do think I associate boasting more with a certain type of masculinity, and perhaps athleticism in this case. I imagine that someone, I'm not a big sports fan, but I imagine someone like maybe Serena Williams, or I feel I heard of athletes that are, particularly, they might show their excitement, and sometimes that might be penalized, right? And consider, oh, she's not feminine enough, right?
Yeah.
Because she will behave. Or what's the Megan Rapinoe, right?
Right.
I think sometimes has been criticized because she celebrates her goals, I think, much like any other male soccer player. But I think because she's a woman, that's considered inappropriate. So I totally do think that maybe I overstated the point a little bit. At the same time, if we think about current say I don't know, maybe WASP US culture, which seems to be a sort of mainstream, of course, in every culture, there's going to be a social group that kind of dictates the emotional norms, right? Or the emotional regime, as some others have said. And so I think in that kind of culture, which is shaped by religious, of course, Christian norms, of avoiding certain kind of sins, like and vainglory, I do think that that most of us will avoid behaving like Muhammad Ali, say, at a professional ceremony for an award, or even at the Oscars, right? But you're not going to be like, in your face, right? So I don't know if that sounds persuasive, and I think so. And I think one reason why I and this has been investigated empirically, if you boast too much, social psychologists have observed that, at least in contemporary American culture, you will risk provoking people to feel more negative emotions toward you, more hostility, probably malicious envy. And so I think that's why we do it. We don't want to attract the evil eye, as anthropologists would put it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. It's interesting you mentioned cultural differences. I mean, obviously, Ali is still alive, and he's in the US right alongside you. But I think the point about gender difference is very well taken. When I think of someone boasting, it's basically always a middle-aged man, or maybe a young man who's doing it. So that's kind of interesting to ponder as well. You didn't bring up gendered so much in the chapter, but
No.
I think a lot of emotions are sort of, what does Maisha Cherry call them? Outlaw emotions for some people. Like,
Yeah.
if you belong to a certain privileged or advantaged or dominant group, then you can have this emotion, but otherwise not. So I think that point is quite well taken.
Yeah, and I do think that they're also interpreted in slightly different ways, right? So again, going back to maybe a female athlete who perhaps shows the very same, she might have this very same behavior, right? And in one case, it's interpreted as, oh, he's proud of his accomplishments, and in another case, it's interpreted as boasting. But again, and also, yeah, there is this idea of outlaw emotions. I think it all goes all the way back to Alison Jagger. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, and I think feminists have been taking up that idea a lot. And I think what Maisha Cherry and others have noticed is that it's really hard for women, for instance, to even feel those emotions, right? Get to feel those emotions. I mean, it started with all the way with anger, right? Women who were not capable of even feeling anger at certain, for instance, sexist behavior. Whereas, or it was, there was no uptake, right? It was interpreted as like, you're crazy. And so I wonder what happens when a woman feels pride, right? The equivalent of anger being seen as hysteria, or, in whether that pride becomes boasting. So if there is, it would be interesting to just see empirically if there is such a, I don't know of any research on this.
Yeah, I'd have to look into it. If it hasn't been done, it obviously should, because that's a pretty plausible hypothesis.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Homeric poems as well. I was thinking, when you mentioned that, of this book by Gregory Nage called The Best of the Achaeans. He was a classicist at Harvard. And the book is basically a reinterpretation of the Iliad, where he argues like the whole thing is essentially a competition among the Achaeans, the Greeks who are besieging Troy, to see which of them is best. And they're all concerned not just to boast, but to boast kind of truthfully, if that makes sense. So they want to be impressive, they want to impress each other, but they want to do so in a way that involves like genuine recognition of their quality, as opposed to being thought that they're better than they really are.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think Ali is kind of like that as well. Like, if someone had just lost a title bout, or if they hadn't even gotten involved and they went around saying, I'm the greatest boxer in the world, they'd get laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
But for him to say that in that moment, especially given how he won, kind of made a certain amount of sense.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because there is on this, there are at least two books that come to mind. I think one by Ed Sanders, one by, the name escapes me, of course, famous classicist, David. Anyway, there are two important books in on envy and related emotions in ancient Greek culture. And of course, there's always a chapter devoted to analyzing Homeric poems, and how these emotions, I mean, these are honor cultures where, like, these warriors, you're right, really, I mean, recognition, social recognition, honor from your peers is an absolutely central value for them. And again, very gendered. There is not obviously a clear equivalent for women in such in a society where women were segregated, where, and so on. But what's interesting is that if I'm thinking about the kind of distinctions that I try to draw in the chapter, for instance, you wouldn't be able to draw them in the same way in those culture, right? I mean, you can't use the same terms. There are words that, phtonos, zealous. I don't remember if there is what would be the Greek term for admiration. Perhaps there would be something, zealous could be translated in some context as admiration. But what's interesting is that you can carve the distinctions in the same way, right? With emotions, you don't carve nature at its joints, or at least most people think you really can't, especially with these complex, culturally shaped emotions. And so, if I'm thinking about, they want admiration, do they also want some sort of envy? Of course they do, but that's what classicists are for, right? You have to, Ed Sanders talk in his book about all the different scripts that I think he individuates 13 different scripts that have to do with jealousy, envy, admiration, and emulation. So it's really interesting how you can't really directly translate these things from one culture to another.
Yeah, that's great. Well, speaking of envy, let's move from boasting to envy.
Yes.
And in the chapter, you distinguish between understanding envy as a two-place or a three-place kind of relation. For people who don't do this kind of philosophy, talking about places, can you just spell out what the difference between those is and why you think the three-place approach is more conceptually useful?
Yeah, so I think, the idea is pretty simple, really. And in this respect, I don't think I'm particularly original or idiosyncratic. I think it's pretty intuitive to think of envy as a relation that involves three parties, three foci, maybe we can say. So you have the agent, the person who feels the emotion, and then let's call them the envier. And then we have the person who's envied, toward whom the envier feels the emotion, right? I look at you and I feel this emotion because I perceive you to be in some sense superior, in a more advantageous position. But with regard to something, right? There is a trait, an object, something that you have and that I don't have. And so these are the three parties involved in this relation. Other scholars in the literature have tried to make do with two, but I think it's more intuitive. I like also how there is a parallel structure with jealousy, which is not part of the chapter's discussion, but I do think that jealousy and envy have a lot in common, and I do think that they share this triadic structure, and it's useful to differentiate in this way. Also, because then, of course, one reason why I care about the three-part relations is that in my analysis of envy, I need to kind of distinguish between the object with regard to which I envy another person and the envy the other person, because that's going to be a central aspect of my taxonomy of envy, where different emphasis and focus of concern on the two things is gonna help me distinguish between different kinds of envy. So for me, I do think it's intuitive, and I'm not, Darms and Jacobson, for instance, they disagree with the idea that there is, for instance, a positive or benign kind of envy, but they still talks about a three-part relation. So I think the three-part understanding is overall pretty popular in the literature. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the idea is something like I could envy one person for their money and another person for their beauty and another person for the fact that everyone likes them.
Yeah, and I could be, in a way, it's important to me that, again, one could say, oh, but you're basically envying, it's the same thing. You can't separate them, right? You can say, I envy that person for their money, but it's not like that you can really separate the two, but you can, right? Because as I talk about in my work, I think you can be more preoccupied or concerned with the fact that it's that person who has the money, or you can be more preoccupied or concerned with the fact that they have the money, and that's what really causes you pain. And this is more intelligible, I think, in cases where you have, some kind of long-standing rivalry, for instance, where perhaps you have this competitive attitude toward this specific person. And so no matter what they have, you become envious of them. And in a way, that what the thing that you envy them for is almost secondary, but you can't draw these subtler distinctions if you don't differentiate between the envied object and the envied person, and vice versa, right? I become envious of you because maybe you have this amazing job in Australia, and you can see all these incredible animals and nature, and it's not I'm not what
And I
really
have such great students.
exactly, and you have such great students who benefit from cool interviews, and and it's not like I have a grudge toward you, but it's kind of natural for me to envy you because you have these things that I care about. And so it's important for me to differentiate more subtly to in a more sophisticated way. And if you have just a two-party relationship, you can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do want to move on to another thing, but before we do, I just wanted to ask, is there a quick way to distinguish envy and jealousy? Because I feel like sometimes we use them almost interchangeably, but jealousy came up in the previous week as well, because in the previous week we covered love and hate, and the chapter I assigned on love is about compersion, where someone positively values the fact that their partner has other romantic or sexual relationships, and how this kind of plays off of and is somewhat opposed to jealousy. And you could think of it as a bit of an envious, or at least an opportunity for envy as well. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on how to distinguish these two?
On this too, the view I espouse is, I think, fairly popular. And I think that's because it's the right view. But to put it in a slogan, very simply, envy is about lack and jealousy is about loss. Envy is about changing the status quo, and jealousy is about preserving the status quo. So imagine that I have a beautiful partner. We think of jealousy as having to do with relationships, so that's the most intuitive case. I have a wonderful partner, I'm very happy with them, and imagine that I'm not in a monogamous relationship, imagine that I am in a monogamous, not a polyamorous relationship, as in many cases, although increasingly less so, but as usually it's the case. And so so the idea is that if someone else gets my partner, then I don't have them, right? In a monogamous relationship. And so I'm protective of this valued good that is my relationship, and I want to protect it from potential attackers. And again, we could do that with other things. I think it's more in some other languages, for instance, Italian, I think we use jealousy more with regard to things. I think even in English, you can say you're jealous of your privacy, maybe, or about your time, but it's not quite as common. But in Italian, that's actually fairly a common thing to say. And so again, the idea in one problem is that if you think about things, then it becomes closer to greed, perhaps, or avarice anyway. But I don't want to get into that because I haven't thought enough about those whereas with jealousy, I don't have a partner, and I look at yours and I'm like, I like that person. And I'm envious of you because you have a wonderful partner, and I'm kind of interested too. And maybe I want them to like me. And so, and this, I think Gabrielle Taylor talks about this idea of thinking about the status quo, which I think is really helpful, right? Jealousy wants to preserve the status quo with regard to an envied good, to a valued good. That I have, and envy is about subverting the status quo. And so it is more proactive, even when it's not aggressive. It is not protective. And because overall, I think most of us have the intuition that if you have a thing, you have a right to it, then jealousy becomes a more legitimate emotion, even though it shouldn't be excessive, right? So we think that jealousy can become pathological. But and this is interesting, the discussion about compersion and polyamory has critiqued this traditional understanding of jealousy as a legitimate emotion, other things equal. But overall, I think in many cultures, we have this idea that jealousy is okay, but envy is not, because envy is about taking away something from someone else. Even though, again, I don't think that it has to be the case. However, it's true that, sorry, the reason why we sometimes confuse, especially in English, I think, it's been argued that because we don't have a term for a kind of positive envy that differentiates it from a malicious envy, then sometimes we use jealousy to indicate a positive kind of envy, because the term jealousy doesn't have the same stigma associated with it. And so I say, oh, I'm so jealous you're going on a vacation. And it's a way of signaling that, hey, I don't want you to not go on your vacation. I'm happy for you, but I also wish I had, your chances,
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking of like the King James translation of the Bible into English, where God says, I'm a jealous God, which I suppose is another kind of relationship that's at stake. And yeah, I guess.
Right. And it shows you also that clearly it can be too bad, right? If God is jealous traditionally is conceived as not as bad as envy, right? Yeah. Because you wouldn't see God saying, I'm envious of other gods, I need to get their followers, their people.
Right.
It doesn't acknowledge other gods, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. It's also interesting to think about this idea that jealousy presupposes a right to the thing that you're jealous of, because if it's your privacy, then of course it makes sense to be jealous of your privacy. But if it's like someone else's love, the idea that you have a right to it, maybe if they're your parent or something, you might have a right to their love. But if it's another adult, then it starts to look less plausible that you could claim an actual right.
Yeah, I do think, and I don't have any solid view on jealousy. I think there is I don't know that you don't own another person, right? But there is something about having built a relationship with a person and having put effort, and because relationships require work, right? They don't just come. Yeah. At least important long-standing ones. And so I don't know. I think this is an interesting question, and maybe it's just because I am a jealous person, so I want to defend it. Yeah, I don't have a philosophical, developed view about jealousy, but I think any view that intends to critique jealousy wholesale needs to account for the fact that I think there is a widespread intuition that there is something that is okay and even flattering. And now I don't remember, I think Christensen defines jealousy actually in his book in his work. He has a lot of books and work on emotion, and I think Christensen, I seem to remember, now I don't remember what the view is. Sorry, this is like, this interview is going to be all like, oh, there's this person who wrote about this thing and it's wonderful. But anyway, there are developed views about jealousy, which I think suggest that, these emotions are there for a reason. And of course, there are bad versions of jealousy, but I think he talks about how it acknowledges some kind of valuable thing that is there. It's a form of acknowledgement of value, if I remember correctly. And I think there is something right to that. By the way, speaking of names, I didn't remember the famous classicist who wrote about envy and spite in classical Greece and Homeric poems is David Constant.
Oh, great.
So
thank you.
In case anybody wants to go look him up, David Constant's work, especially for students who might be interested in, who are in also classics or might be interested in, David Constant is the person to look at.
Great. Yeah, just to follow up on that a little bit, I think you have a right to someone's affection if they've promised it to you. So in cases where like commitments have been made, then jealousy makes more sense.
Yeah.
And then I guess also I agree with at least either with Christensen or what you've said about Christensen, which
Yeah.
is that if you're not jealous about something or someone, then maybe you don't care. And so it might be a pathological way of expressing care in some cases, but it is evidence that you care, and of course that is that can be flattering.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's obvious how it can go wrong, but that, that happens to any emotion, right? I mean, I feel like the Gollum in The Lord of the Rings shows the kind of bad jealous, but but in a way, the way Gollum like talks to the ring and is very protective about it, right? I mean, you can see how it goes wrong, but there is something about, there's this precious thing here that I'm holding, and I want to protect it. And I think that's or as you were mentioning, children toward parents, Matthew Liao has argued that children have a right to be loved in a strong sense. And I think there is something to it. And I think when children are jealous, for instance, of siblings, again, it can go very wrong, but it seems developmentally appropriate. And it seems to be there for reasons, right? Children need to be taken care for. And so it's pretty natural that they develop not only obviously these strong bonds of attachment, but they're also pretty jealous of their parents because, they need to be taken care of. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Great. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. So in the chapter, you say there's sort of two main impulses or motives associated with envy. One is a kind of leveling up, at least when possible, given the obtainability of the envied good, and the other is leveling down. I wonder, like, are there no other options? I guess, up and down sort of exhausts the metaphorical space in a sense. But like, couldn't the envier decide that they just don't care about the good?
Yeah,
Or at
good.
least not associate it with their identity and come to care about it in a different way, or come to care about it less?
Yeah, they can. Good. So I think that the two tendencies are exhaustive if we're thinking about direct coping mechanisms. Sometimes people talk about Darms and Jacobson, especially in their work, I think, talk about satisfying envy. However, that's a term that is not present in the empirical literature, so I don't use it. But I think what satisfying envy means, I think it suggests this idea that there is one direct way. I mean, if you think of it as primarily a desire, which it's not just a desire, but if you think of the emotion as a desire, or as centrally involving a desire, right? Then there are these two ways of satisfying envy, right? Either you level up and you get the envy good as well, or the other person loses it. And then of course there might be there are complications, but that's set to this aside. But then I think there is an indirect way of coping with envy, which is not a satisfaction of envy in that sense, but it's still a resolution of some sort of other, and that is, as you said, you could decide that after all you don't want that thing, and of course this is falls under the general phenomenon of sour grape syndrome. Some people think it's necessarily irrational, but I don't think that's. I mean, it's traditionally studied as a form of irrationality or maladaptive response. But I actually think that there are situations where it's not only it's perfectly rational, but it shows a moral growth. It can show growth. For instance, I might be envious of someone because they have an expensive watch, and I'm all caught up in this conspicuous consumption rat race. Everybody has to get the most expensive watch because then you're cool. And then one day I'm like, what am I doing? Who cares what are we all doing here? We're all spending more and more money to get these watches, but you know what? I don't need this, right? What I need is a good watch that is comfortable, that, helps me see the time or whatever. Well, nobody uses watches, Justin watches in the time
It counts
anymore,
your
but
steps, I think.
so I don't even, the only watch I've ever had was a regular watch, and now I don't even use that. But whatever its function is, you realize the point is not to be cooler than the other person. And so you just step back and say, I don't really need that watch. And your envy might just slowly fade away. Now, it's not always as simple, right? And perhaps what happens is that you realize maybe what I really envy that person is not the watch. Maybe it's self-assurance that goes with the watch. Maybe it's the self-confidence. Maybe it's the fact that everybody likes them. I don't know, right? And some of those things might be worth caring about. But I think you can reassess your values and priorities. And I think that's one way of coping with envy. And sometimes you cope with envy by detaching yourself from the situation altogether. If this kind of envy, if you have a particularly, a relation that is particularly fraught and full of envy, maybe sometimes the things to do, you shouldn't either level up or down. You should just take yourself out of the situation, because maybe that person is not a good person to be around for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So earlier in the semester, we've talked a bit about adaptive preferences.
Right.
And I think
Exactly.
it's clear that in a case where someone's adaptive preferences lead them to be envious, then maybe the better thing is to sort of change what you care about so that you don't feel that envy anymore, rather than either leveling up or leveling down.
Yeah. And I think, there is a big literature on adaptive preferences, and I don't know it very well at all. But I think one thing that I find persuasive is the kind of position, and I think this happens especially in relation to disability and preferences of disabled individuals, or sometimes this happens with regard to preferences, for instance, of women in non-Western world. Serene Kader has worked on this, I think. But sometimes we dismiss people's preferences as adaptive in a negative sense, right? Oh, they just learn to cope with fewer choices, and that's irrational. But if you look at it from the other perspective, you can think of it as sensitivity to your environment, to the reality. And I don't think there is anything irrational about adapting your preferences to an environment and your choices.
Yeah, that's great. I actually assigned a chapter from Cater's book
Oh,
earlier
okay,
this
great. Yeah.
semester.
So
So
your
that's
students
a
will
nice
know much more than me on that.
that's a nice callback, though. Yeah,
Yeah.
great. So in your chapter, you distinguish four sort of types of envy. So there's the emulative envy, inert envy, aggressive envy, and spiteful envy. And you kind of associate each of these with a different pattern of behavior. So like emulative envy motivates striving, inert envy motivates sulking, aggressive envy motivates stealing, and spiteful envy motivates spoiling. I really like the fact that you've got an S word for each
I'm
of
proud
these.
of that too.
It helps me remember. I was
Yeah.
actually telling someone about your theory last week, and I was like, what are the four S's?
Yes.
Um, yeah, but can you spell those out in a bit more detail for someone who read the chapter quickly or maybe didn't read it
Yeah.
at all?
Yes.
So we have a better idea of your
Yeah.
framework.
Yeah. And I should say, this can be done. Sometimes I like to do it by keeping the same kind of case. And sometimes I change the scenario completely. And there are two different argumentative strategies that have different advantages and disadvantages. So let me start by using the same scenario, and then I'll say what are the limitations of that kind of method. So imagine I'm a dancer. There's a lot of envy in the dance world, I think, more or less confessed and admitted. And I think that's partially because you see other people's superiority very vividly, right? It's in their body, it's in what cannot be hidden, right? Whose leg is higher, who does more pirouettes or whatever. And so imagine that I envy someone who's just a little better than me, right? Her legs are a little higher, her she turns more, she's more beautiful, and so on. And so in fact, I remember, I really have, this is from, real life. There was this beautiful dancer who was just a bit older than me. And I remember one day seeing her leg was shaking. And I had an epiphany. I was like, it's not that she's just naturally better. She works really hard at it. You can see the effort it takes. And I realized, well, I can do that. That I can do. I can start working as hard. Probably I haven't just worked hard enough. And because I didn't care about her being worse, I really wanted to get better. I was more focused on the lack of the envied good than on the envied. And I thought I could achieve what she had achieved. And so I started working harder in dance class, and, I did, my dancing improved. And so what I was feeling was this emulative envy that motivates to self-improvement, to strive for the goal. And the envy is someone to emulate, literally, right? It's a model for self-improvement. But imagine that instead, I had been looking at someone who had a very different body type from mine, beautiful arch that I don't have. And then and who was maybe just naturally very talented. Then my envy would have been this kind of inert, counterproductive envy, where I would perceive myself as incapable of becoming a beautiful ballerina like that, just because you have the body that you have, right? There are limits to what you can achieve with hard work. And so I would have been, oh, she's beautiful, I really want to be like that, but I'll never be like that. And so that's the kind of sulking, you're sullen, you're like, and that's the kind of, I think it's actually a very common and sad form of envy that is not discussed enough in the empirical literature. It's not malicious. I don't think it's malicious at all. It probably motivates people to, again, detach themselves from the relationship if there is a relationship. And again, to use a different kind of case, I think this is actually fairly common. I've read a lot of posts and articles about people who feel baby envy. And the fact that, a lot of people, mostly women, but not necessarily women, they want to have a biological baby. And that's, of course, to some extent beyond our control, right? There are limits to what we can do. If you're infertile, you're infertile. And a lot of these women, they will say things like, I don't want to go to my friend's baby shower. I just can't. I would never want her to lose her baby, but I really don't want to be around her. And, I think this is compatible, if something happens, if, God forbid, something happens to my friend's baby, I think it might be possible to feel a little bit of relief, but I don't think that's necessarily proof of malice as much as, okay, the source of my pain has disappeared. And I think this is a sticky point where some other authors disagree, and they think that necessarily involves malice, and that's proof that envy has to be malice. And then you have aggressive envy. Sometimes, imagine I look at this other ballerina and maybe I just really don't like her. We know that when we don't like a person, we are more likely to feel a hostile form of envy. Maybe she's conceited, maybe she's arrogant, maybe she always boasts her beautiful pirouettes, right? She's not modest, she's not humble. I really dislike her. And so that's what bugs me, right? That she's the one who's dancing better than me. She's the one who's getting the role. And in the book, not in another book from not the one that you all are reading from, but in my book on envy, I also talk about potentially forms of, for instance, racism. There can be racist forms of envy. So imagine that, I'm white and this dancer is black and I'm racist. And so I think, oh, it's not possible, right? Why is this person getting the role and I'm not getting the role, or something like that? And in that case, of course, this kind of situation, I'm not going to be motivated to self-improve, because I have this, what bugs me is that she has this better opportunities or position. And so I just want to bring her down.
Right, because you might even think that you're already better or as good. So there's no
right. So I think, and this is where the limits of using this very same scenario become apparent. I think that this envy makes a lot more sense when we envy people where again, like there are some things where really we focus more on external things that therefore can be stolen. So for instance, instead of envying the beautiful grace with which she dances, which in this case, because I'm racist, I don't even acknowledge, imagine I envy her because she got the role that I wanted.
Mhm.
In that case, I will do all I can to steal her role, right? I use sometimes this example, like, you push her down the stairs, and people do, people do bad things to each other sometimes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
People
yeah.
sabotage each other all the time. And so it's not, just at a beauty pageant, you, I don't know, you take away the makeup from your, these things happen. I got pins in my dance shoes once, so. I will never know if it was intentional, but I did have needles like
Okay.
in my shoes. And so you sabotage the other so you can get the role. Of course, you haven't self-improved. You haven't really strived to become better, but you have stolen the good, and you have worsened the other person's situation. And finally, sometimes you can do that. So imagine, again, in the case of the ballerina, maybe I'm just gonna burn the theater down because I can't get the role, I'm not good enough, but nobody should be dancing. Or less dramatically, I often use the example of a little child who breaks the toy that they can have. Maybe the teacher is watching, and you don't get to play with that toy, and so you break it. And this is spiteful envy. There is this idea of envy spoils the good it covets, and I don't think all envy spoils the good it covets, but definitely spiteful envy, the envy we see also in plays like Othello. Iago ruins everybody's life. He ends up in jail. Not a happy ending. Lots of people die. Sorry for the spoiler for those of you who have not seen the play. But Iago does a lot of damage, and he is a typical spiteful envy where you just, I think he tries to gain some advantage, but in the end he just fails.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so some of those examples are clearly criticizable forms of envy. But you want to say that at least sometimes envy is not criticizable. Would you say that this is only true of emulative envy, or would it also be the case for some of the other three?
So it depends criticizable from what perspective, right? I'm sure, in your class, you have talked about probably fittingness conditions. So I think all four kinds of envy can be fitting to the situation. And in that regard, or they can be unfitting, so they can be in a way criticized for being unfitting. But then, of course, many of them are criticizable from a moral perspective. I think they're immoral. They bring people to do immoral things. I think neither emulative nor inert envy are morally bad. Assuming that the good at stake is good, right? Because if I feel emulative envy for a torturer, clearly, then that's morally criticizable, because the good is not actually good, it's a bad. So this ties in also with the discussion of evil, I guess.
Yeah.
But assuming that the good, as for most people, it's actually a good thing, then emulative envy is not prudential, it's not morally bad neither, and it's not prudentially bad because it's good for you, it motivates you to self-improve. And I think now there is actually really a decent amount of empirical evidence for this, with the proviso that a lot of psychologists talk about benign envy, and benign envy is defined, I think I can use a lot of their evidence, but they're not quite the same thing. Emulative envy is a little different. It's than just simple benign envy. Benign envy is just it. Psychologists don't use this idea of focus of concern. So anyway, but we're getting into too tiny details for your students, I think. And so I think emulative envy is neither prudentially nor morally bad, assuming that the good is good. Inert envy is prudentially bad. It's by definition counterproductive. It's this self-defeating emotion because you want something that you think you can't have. So inert envy is prudentially bad, but it's not bad for others. It's not morally bad.
And I guess if it's part of if it's part of a longer process of detachment, it might even be as a means or instrumentally good, even if the bout of sulking doesn't do you any good directly.
Yeah, exactly. And psychologists do talk about the fact that it is a protective reaction to your self-esteem, right? So it can be functional. You just take yourself away from a situation that is just harmful in some ways. And I think aggressive envy can be prudentially bad. Can be prudentially good because you can obtain real advantages. They might be short-lived. I mean, it depends how. Here, it depends a little bit how cynical you are, right? And it depends a little bit. These outcomes will change a little bit depending on your normative theories, right? What counts as a good, and if there are duties toward oneself. I mean, so things get a little more complicated depending on what other commitments you have with regard to your moral theory. But let's just say that I think other things equal, aggressive envy can be prudentially advantageous in some cases. And finally, spiteful envy is always morally and prudentially bad because nobody seems to benefit from it. The good is destroyed, it's spoiled, and nobody gets anything. So
maybe this is going too far afield, but I wonder whether even spiteful envy could be prudentially good in certain cases that involve reputation. Like, if I show that I'm willing to burn the theater down if I don't get what I want, then probably people are just going to give me what I want or toss me in jail, right? But like, it's a high risk strategy that can establish a reputation for sort of violent negative reciprocity, and sometimes you need that.
Yeah. Well, and here again, I think this goes back to the kind of normative commitments you have, because some people, if you are someone who thinks, I mean, if you're a Stoic, or if you're someone who think that this cannot be good, right? Nothing can count as good if it's obtained through blackmailing, right? They will say, no, this is still bad. But there are some people who are perfectly fine with having a more ecumenical notion of the good, or a notion of the good that is not quite as saintly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of, a situation where
thinking,
you're in a kind of Hobbesian state of nature.
right?
Where
I was
really
gonna say, I'm thinking evolutionarily kind of, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you've mentioned admiration a few times, and we've already contrasted envy with jealousy. Maybe now it would be useful to contrast envy with admiration, especially since they're both in the title of the chapter. So you say that envy has a negative valence while admiration has a positive valence. And there's also some evidence that envy is more motivating, especially this kind of emulative envy that you mentioned before. More motivating than admiration is, which kind of seems to be more sort of an observer stance than an agentic stance. Are there other differences that you would call out between envy and admiration? And do you think admiration is always benign, or can it also go wrong in some of the ways that envy can go wrong?
Oh, definitely. I think any positive affect emotion, or even any emotion that on the surface seems just good, like love, can go wrong. I think all emotions can go wrong, but we'll get to that. Yeah, so you already presented two of the most important differences between envy, emulative envy, and admiration. And again, even though they both involve this looking up to someone, they both involve some kind of comparison. The upward gaze is slightly different. In the case of admiration, it's really this much more vertical gaze that is much more focused. It's more about the object. It's like, oh, there's this object of exceptional value. This is so amazing. And often it's a person, right? This person who's so much more amazing than me. And so, as Kierkegaard said, it's happy self-surrender, although it can involve a little bit of fear and discomfort. It could be slightly mixed emotion, but I think overall the affect is much more positive. Typically, we don't feel this emotion toward a similar other, or at least not with regard, or if it's a similar other, not with regard to domain of self-importance. So, it could be that there has to be some larger gap, whether it's they're very different from us, they do something that is very different. Like I'm a philosopher, she's a soccer player, or, I'm a philosopher, she's a scientist, or perhaps we're both philosophers, but she's this amazing, I don't know, athlete, and I am not. And so the comparison basically doesn't make me feel bad about myself, right? The gap is sufficiently large that we're not in the same comparison class, or it doesn't reflect in a significant way on me. And so that's why it's overall pleasant, and it can be inspiring. The empirical evidence seems to show that what happens is that it can motivate to self-improve, but in the long run, and it broadens cognitive processing. It's more about, oh, look at that, look at all the things that I could be doing maybe in 20 years from now, or something like that. Whereas envy is really this much more like, think about the iconography of envy as like squinted eyes. I'm looking, it's a little diagonal, right? You're a little better than me, but we're close enough that your success, Aristotle would say, is a reproach to me. Like, why are you doing so well? We're so similar, but yet you're doing a little bit better. And because it has to do with it, with a domain of self-importance, right? So for instance, dance, I care about dancing. If my colleague is a great soccer player, I can admire her. I don't care about dancing. But if my colleague is, a slightly better dancer than me, well, then this starts to affect me in some ways or other. And so there is a narrowing of the cognitive processing, and it's this more limited in scope, but more immediate motivation to self-improve, right? It really helps me zoom in on, oh, her legs are higher, how can I get there? And so they just play different roles. They're like all emotions, right? They work for different reasons, and we evolved to feel them for different things. So I think we need both, right? We need to both look at the big picture, be inspired by people who do amazing things. But you know how it is. Sometimes we admire people and we're like, oh, that's so great. Okay, but what are you going to do about it? Right. And then it's just there. It's a pleasant emotion. It doesn't motivate you as much as the envy is this
Yeah.
is this sorry, the term in English doesn't come up to me now.
And needling. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
needling,
Yeah.
right? Okay, that's more motivating in the short run. But again, I think it does have really potentially large consequences, right? So I don't want people to think that because envy's motivation to self-improve seems to be more short term, that it might still have large ramifications. So, again, going back to my dance example, even having that one motivation to work harder on something because this other person has it adds up, right? And then you can become a much stronger dancer if this keeps happening, if you keep having the right kind of envy again, and not the negative one when you go and put needles in people's shoes or burn theaters down. That's not good. Don't do it, kids. Not suggesting that.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess with admiration, it's also similar to what you said about envy earlier, where if the thing that you're admiring in someone is not good, then that is going to infect the admiration. So like
Exactly.
Alfred Archer has written about this with
Yes.
people who take moral exemplars who are actually bad people.
Yeah.
So like Mother Teresa or something. If you're like, I want to be just like her, and then you find out, she really reveled in the suffering of the women that she was caring for. It's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't emulate them.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, all cults, I think. I mean, it's probably more complicated than that because I'm sure there are other emotions at play. But I imagine, without knowing too much about the psychology of cults, I imagine that the cult leader is the object of a lot of admiration. But that, of course, can be extremely, extremely problematic. More so in a way than envy, right? Because I think it's gonna lead for it's gonna have very different effects. I think very few people will envy the leader in those kind of scenarios, but they're going to admire him, and then they're going to be willing to do, the terrible things that happen in cults, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, so this actually brings me to the next thing I wanted to mention, which is this idea that like there's different kinds of leveling up. I've done some work on Nietzsche, which I think I mentioned to you before in a different conversation. And he seems to distinguish, or actually he quite explicitly distinguishes between leveling up that tries to sort of match or become sort of qualitatively identical to the object of emulative envy on the one hand, from cases where you try to like one up somebody. And so you're not trying to do exactly what they do, but you're trying to do the thing better.
Yeah.
And on the assumption that no one's perfect, which seems pretty plausible, I think that kind of one-upsmanship might even be healthier in some cases. It's also more challenging, so you're going to fail more often if this is your motivation, rather than purely matching. But I do think that it might actually be healthier and help people to see the flaws in the people that they either admire or envy, rather than to see them as like, I want to be just like that.
Yeah. And I don't know that there is much empirical literature on this distinction, actually, even though there should be. But one thing that this idea of, because you could what's the term?
One-upsmanship, yeah.
One-upsmanship, too long for me. That could be both negative or positive, right? Because you could have a kind where you're not trying to be the better version of yourself or the other person, but it's just, again, if it's more focused on the envied, right, then it's going to be like, oh, I just want to be better than you. And that doesn't necessarily seem positive, because it can go wrong in all sorts of ways. But if what you care about is the trait or the achievement, then it's really positive. So I think you can draw the distinction within that attitude too. But I'm thinking in particular that there is some interesting work being done in moral philosophy by Maria Silvia Vaccarezza and Ariel Nicoli, and they have been working about what they call inspiring envy, where they critique my work to an extent, because they say, look, you have to be more specific about what kind of emulation we're talking about. You don't want to have mere imitation, because especially for things like moral education and becoming a better person, you don't want to just imitate the other, right? You want to say, be a good moral agent, which requires learning how to do things, right, independently from just mimicking someone's behavior. And so I think expanding, and so they talk about inspiring envy and expanding this idea to also non-moral domains, but still good things, right? Maybe sports achievement or other kind of non-moral qualities. I think, yeah, there is something about feeling a kind of envy that it's not just about getting exactly up there, but using the envied person as a source of inspiration. So almost combining, and again, I think they do rely on some empirical literature, but you want to almost combine admiration and emulative envy and have this even better emotion where you have the needling of envy, and this is about me, like I want to become a better person just like that person, but better. But united with this idea of admiration that is also, that inspires you, that this broadening of possibility, this aiming for higher goals. And so that maybe is even the best possible combination.
Yeah, something to aspire to.
Yeah.
Well, so for the last question, I realize I'm taking a lot of your time, but
oh no, it's okay. I just noticed that now I'm afraid there is more light behind me because the sun has gone down, so apologies. I'm not as visible.
It's all good. Yeah. So I wanted to get to the last bit of the chapter where you talk about politics and the way that envy and admiration function in politics. So I'm very aware that the chapter was written a few years ago. and things have happened in the subsequent years.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I guess I'm mostly just curious, what do you think of the points that you made in the chapter? Would you revise anything in light of
Yeah.
recent
Yeah.
developments? How have things panned out?
Yeah, I have in fact revised them. So in the book that I published after the chapter, The Philosophy of Envy, I have this discussion of envy and including emulative envy in the political sphere, and I'm more cautious. I'm more cautious than I was. And the reason is that I've come to realize how much the political sphere is different from the personal sphere. Duh, should have known. But I've thought more about it, and I do think that envy is more dangerous in a context, in a highly divided public sphere. And sorry, I should say public sphere. It's not just about politics, it's about this interpersonal relationships in a larger community where people don't know each other as well. And especially right now in the US, there is a lot of polarization and political divisions and just sheer antipathy. Like people don't like each other if they are, in different parties, unfortunately also in different, racial groups and social groups. And there is, I think, this increased atomization of one social circle. And so I do think that there is a lot, when there is so much division, we tend to feel more hostility. And so we tend to focus more on the envied, and therefore we feel more aggressive and spiteful envy. I see a lot of spite in politics. Maybe this is not new actually, but I've come to realize that we have to be really careful with emulative envy. And so in the book, I talk about it as perhaps more of a transitional emotion, an emotion that can pave the way for admiration in some cases and resentment in others. Resentment as a moral emotion that focuses on injustice. And when you focus on injustice, it's obviously it is injustice that is done to you, but it should be in virtue of the injustice that you get angry or that you feel the affect, and not in virtue of the fact that you are in a less advantageous position. I mean, this is not to say that there is no space for emulative envy in the political sphere, but I do think it's just a little harder to feel it, because I think we don't like each other as much as sometimes, I think it's easier to feel, I've talked about emulative envy toward your friends, toward your partners, toward your parents, even toward your children. I think these are all normal emotions, but usually we love and like the people we have relationships with. And so I think emulative envy is easier to feel. Whereas in the public sphere, I think I've become a little less positive. I think envy does a lot of damage, and I do think it should be studied more. It's actually pretty surprising that there hasn't been more work on political envy. Now, a lot of people have been talking about political anger, cherry, and so many others. Contempt, McAllister Bell and others, even shame. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion of political emotions, but envy has not been discussed as much, especially with regard to contemporary problems, as opposed to old debates in distributive justice post John Rawls.
Yeah. Yeah, well, much to ponder. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm sure that the students will as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.